Welcome back to Lunaform, a now 3D isometric construction management game where you play as a robot named Luna set with the task of terraforming the moon. We now have a 3D environment set up in Unity with a 10 voxel by 10 voxel tile map that Luna can move around on. First task this week is to increase the map size and start adding some variety so it looks more like a moon surface and less like a test area. There are a few requirements for the terrain generation. 1. It has to be procedurally generated. This means that it will be different every time the user starts a new game. 2. It all needs to take place inside one large crater. If we were to colonise the moon, the likely starting point would be a large crater close to one of the poles. A large crater offers shade from the radiation, with almost no sunlight getting to the crater floor, with the ridge of some of the craters experiencing almost constant sunlight, perfect for solar panels. Craters near the pole are most likely to contain ice, which can be used for water, oxygen and rocket fuel. This also means that it's going to be dark almost all of the time, so lights will need to come from Luna and the various buildings. 3. It needs to have randomly placed features like rocks, small craters, and eventually resources, but ultimately still needs to be relatively barren and flat, as that is most likely what the large crater would be like. And lastly, all of this needs to be easily changeable so that I can test each feature. So, let's get started. After doing some research, I found out that one of the most common ways to create varied landscapes that change every time you play is to use something called perlin noise. Perlin noise is a way to make a smoothly changing random pattern, like rolling hills or cloudy skies. Basically, it takes a collection of random values and smooths them out to create a more continuous pattern. Instead of jumping straight from one random value to another, which is basically what noise is, it blends them together so you start to get groups of randomness that are now connected and can influence each other. We can adjust the scale of the perlin noise to control how spread out or tightly packed the hills and valleys are, and the fall off to basically control how high the hills are. We can also change the octaves, which controls a more intricate level of variation, but I actually don't think we'll need that due to the fact we are using reasonably large voxels, so any small changes wouldn't really be visible. We also need Luna to be able to roll over all of the terrain, so we want it to be relatively flat and smooth. At least for now anyway. So, I wrote a script that allows me to set a width and a height of the tile map, along with the scale and height of the perlin noise. Although it worked, I seemed to get some weird cut-off halfway through the tile map. At first I thought it was something to do with the lights I had added to Luna, as they seemed to cut off also in the editor mode, so I spent a long time adding and removing lights, playing with all of the settings and the shadows. Eventually, I realised it was due to the angle of the camera I'd set up, meaning the terrain was being clipped as it cut through the camera view. I added some acceleration and deceleration to Luna's movement so that she moves around a bit more smoothly, again using values that can be changed easily for tweaking. With the change in terrain, Luna's height now needs to be changed from a fixed Y position to a dynamic one. She needs to move up and down over the terrain and not through it. This was a relatively simple code fix that looks at the height of the terrain at Luna's X and Z position and updates her Y position every time the frame updates. The moon is a dusty place, so I wanted Luna to be kicking up some of that dust as she moves around. With Unity, this is as simple as adding a new particle effect in the hierarchy. We attach it to the Luna object, tweaking some of the settings to get the size and disbursement looking realistic. We then apply the same material used for the terrain voxels, and then update Luna's movement script to run the particle effect when she is moving and stop it when she stops. At this point I started to see some drops in performance, which I was kind of expecting at some point due to the lights, the shadows, the particle effects and the voxel count, so it's been in the back of my mind this week. I wasn't expecting it so early in the game's development though, so this is definitely going to need looking at. I played around with some of the quality settings, which seem to help for now. I also found fog. I know there is no fog on the moon, but I feel like it suits the ambience of the game's visuals. Whilst there is no atmosphere on the moon, and therefore no weather, you actually do get dust storms up there along something called the Terminator line. This is the line that runs from the North Pole to the South Pole that represents the crossover between night and day, and there is believed to be a long, skinny, swirling dust storm that runs through the Terminator line. Also, here is a photo I took recently of the full moon that I thought was pretty cool. I'm really pleased with how this game is starting to look. I know that the textbook way of developing a game is to focus on the gameplay first and the visuals later, but this is something I'm going to be looking at a lot. It needs to be pleasing to work on and it needs to inspire new ideas, so I think that some basic visual polish is important. It also helps me learn where that line between performance and quality is, which in turn might help shape some of the game's features, so I think it's worth the time and the effort at this early stage. That's my excuse anyway. Next up, craters. I added a script that generates some randomly placed circles in the terrain and lowers the height of the voxels that make up this section. I gave them a slightly darker colour and this proved to be some pretty reasonable looking craters. We can change the number of craters that are generated, as well as setting the minimum and maximum radius of each crater, as well as the crater depth. Using the same perlin noise function as the terrain, I added another script that creates some random clusters of rocks. The density determines how many clusters of rocks there are, and we can set a minimum and maximum number of rocks per cluster, as well as the variation between the size of the rocks. Giving it all the same voxel prefab used for the terrain and the particles keeps it aligned with the game's art style, although I gave it several different materials to add some colour variation. This seemed to be working well at first, but then I noticed that you could only see the rocks within the craters. I found out this was happening because of the order of execution. The rocks were being generated first and the terrain on top. We need it to be the other way around. This took a lot longer to figure out than it probably should have, but it often is the simplest issue that takes the longest time to fix. I've lost count of the amount of times I've spent an entire day trying to fix something, only to find out it was a spelling mistake, a missed colon, or an unchecked tick box. That's just the reality of programming, and every developer knows the struggle all too well. This led me on to my next problem to solve. We need a boundary for the map. The idea of the game taking place within a large crater gives us the perfect, plausible solution. I created a function with the terrain generation code that takes the width and height of the overall map, divides it by 2 to get the radius for a circle that spans out from the centre of the map. The edge of that circle should sit at the overall map's edge, then we can fill everything outside of that circle with voxels to create a wall. This worked, but it also killed the performance. Every time we add a single voxel, the game has to render it as a separate object. We're now getting into the tens of thousands of individual cube-shaped voxels, so we definitely need to find a way to optimise this. For now, we'll limit the height of the wall and decrease the size of the map, and add that to the list of performance optimisations needed, but we will definitely need to work on this sooner rather than later. Lastly, I made it so there is a stepped effect for the crater's edge rather than a vertical wall. These seem to work really well, I thought, and gives the impression of a large crater with a sloped edge whilst defining our map boundary in a way that looks realistic. Using the same diameter as the circle for the outer wall, I amended Lunar's movement code using Unity's clamp function, which basically means that Luna can only move around within that given area. Before I get started on actual gameplay features, there are just a few more things I want to implement. First is to create a lander that Luna arrives on. This will act as our main base and will be the location for many of the core gameplay features. I wanted the lander to be somewhat similar to Luna, so I started with a large cube and worked from there. Using Magica Voxel again, and images of various spaceships and landers, as well as some voxel art from various artists, I made this rather basic looking spacecraft and imported it into Unity. I gave it a box collider and a rigid body so that Luna would not be able to move through it. Although this wasn't exactly what I was looking for. As always, this wasn't just a straightforward fix, and in trying to solve one problem, I created a completely separate one. But again, that's just the nature of programming. This has been a really great week progress-wise. We have a procedurally generated terrain map with random craters and various clusters of rocks, all contained within a large outer crater. We have Lunaform base from which we can start working on some gameplay features. I have a lot of ideas for this which I'll start to go through in the next video. For now though, thank you very much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.